3 I'd been planning that trip for the better part of 2 years. Nothing elaborate, just me, my pack, and a 5-day stretch of the Appalachian Trail through a section of western North Carolina I'd never walked before. I'd done solo trips before, plenty of them, and I knew the mountains well enough to respect them without being afraid of them. I was 34 years old, reasonably fit, and I'd spent enough time in the backcountry to know the difference between the sounds that belonged there and the ones that didn't. I tell you all of that because I want you to understand that what happened wasn't the product of an overactive imagination or first-time nerves. I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know what was waiting outside my tent that night. The first 2 days were everything I'd needed them to be. The trail in that section runs along a ridgeline before dropping into a series of coves, and the light that time of year, mid-October, comes through the canopy in long amber sheets that make the whole forest feel like something out of an old photograph. The leaves were just past peak. The air carried that particular cold, clean smell that only exists at elevation in autumn. I saw 2 other hikers on the first day, and nobody after that. By the second night, I had settled into that deep, animal quiet that comes when you've been away from roads and screens and other people long enough for your nervous system to remember what silence actually feels like. I noticed the figure on the afternoon of the 3rd day. I was moving along a section of trail that curved around the shoulder of a ridge, the slope dropping away steeply to my left into a hollow choked with rhododendron. To my right, the ridge continued up through a stand of mature white pines, their trunks straight and close together, the ground beneath them carpeted in brown needles. I'd just come around a long bend in the trail when something made me look up, not a sound, not a movement, just some instinct that pulled my eyes to the tree line on the right. It was standing about 200 yards away, at the edge of the pines where the trees gave way to a narrow strip of open ground before the trail. I stopped walking. The figure was tall, I registered that immediately, and it was standing completely still, partially obscured by the last row of trees in that way that could have been a person leaning, or a shadow falling wrong, or any number of things that turn out to be nothing. I stood there for a moment, watching it, waiting for it to move, or resolve itself into something ordinary. It didn't. I called out a single hey, the way you do when you want to acknowledge another hiker without committing to a conversation. Nothing. No wave, no response, no movement at all. I told myself it was someone resting, taking in the view. Maybe they hadn't heard me. I kept walking. It was 20, maybe 25 minutes later when I looked back. I do that sometimes on trails check behind me the way you check a rearview mirror. Just habit. The figure was still there. I stopped again and turned all the way around to look. Same position, same stillness. Except that it was closer now, not by a little, but by enough that the difference was unmistakable even at distance. It was at the edge of the tree line still, but the tree line was closer now. Or rather, the figure had moved forward to where the pines gave way to the open ground I had passed through 20 minutes ago. I had not heard a single footstep. Not one. The woods around me had gone quiet, in the way they sometimes do when a front comes through a sudden, total absence of birdsong and wind, and the small ambient rustling that you stop noticing until it's gone. That particular silence has a weight to it. It presses on you. I felt it press on me then, and I understood in a way that bypassed rational thought entirely that I was no longer alone on that trail in any comfortable sense of the word. I turned back around and kept moving. My pace had increased without any conscious decision to make it do so. My body had made the calculation before my mind caught up. I made camp that evening near a creek about 4 miles from where I'd seen the figure. I told myself that 4 miles was enough. I told myself the figure had been another hiker, someone moving quietly, someone who hadn't felt like talking. I set up my tent on a flat gravel bar beside the water, ate a cold meal because I didn't feel like dealing with the stove, and was inside my sleeping bag before dark. I told myself everything I needed to tell myself to make sleep possible. For a few hours, it worked. I woke at 2:17 inches the morning. I know the time because I checked my watch, lying flat on my back in my sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling and trying to identify what had pulled me out of sleep. The creek was still running. The wind was low. There was no sound I could point to and name. And then there was breathing. It was coming from just outside the tent, maybe 3 feet from where I was lying on the side opposite the door, so that whatever was producing the sound was positioned between my tent and the creek bank. The sound was slow, deeply rhythmic, patient in a way that I can only describe as deliberate, as if whatever was producing it understood that I was awake and was making no effort to conceal itself. It wasn't labored. It wasn't animal in the way that a deer or a bear sounds animal, all snort and unpredictability. This was steady and even and calm in a way that made it infinitely worse than any sound I could have imagined. I did not move. My right hand found my knife without any conscious direction from me. It was just suddenly in my hand, unsheathed, pressed against my thigh inside the sleeping bag. I lay there and I listened, and I ran every rational explanation I could manufacture through my head, one after another, trying to find one that fit the sound and the stillness and the memory of that figure in the tree line, and couldn't make any of them hold together. A person standing that still, moving that silently, following for 4 miles, now standing 3 feet from my tent in the dark of 2 in the morning, doing nothing but breathing, with a patience that suggested they had nowhere else they needed to be. I want to tell you that I said something, called out, demanded to know who was there, did anything that resembled the behavior of a person in control of themselves. I didn't. I lay completely still with my knife in my hand, and I listened, and I waited, and I did nothing else for what my watch later told me was 47 minutes. The breathing continued for most of that time, slow, consistent, never changing tempo, never moving closer or further, never accompanied by any other sound, no shuffling of feet, no rustling of clothing, nothing. And then, somewhere around the 45-minute mark, it simply stopped. Not faded, stopped. As if a switch had been thrown. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It had a quality of vacancy to it, an absence that felt total. And I understood that whatever had been standing there was no longer standing there. Though I could not tell you how I knew that or exactly when the transition had occurred, I did not sleep again. I lay with my knife in my hand and watched the darkness inside my tent slowly become a lighter shade of darkness, and then a pale gray, and then finally, something I was willing to call morning. And the moment there was enough light to see by, I was unzipping the tent door. The grass on the creek bank on that side of the tent was pressed flat. Not trampled the way you'd expect if something had moved through, laid flat, smoothly, in a rough circle maybe 5 feet across. The blades bent uniformly in a way that suggested sustained downward pressure over a long period of time. Like something had crouched or knelt there for the better part of an hour and simply waited. The ground at the center of the circle was slightly disturbed. The fine silt of the creek bank compressed in a way that I studied for a long time without being able to make it tell me something I was comfortable hearing. I broke camp in under 10 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't filter water. I put everything in my pack without organizing it, and I started moving down the trail in the direction of the trailhead with no intention of stopping for anything. I moved for 6 hours without a meaningful break, and I came out of those mountains in the early afternoon, put my pack in my car, and sat in the driver's seat for a long time before I was ready to start the engine. I've thought about going back. I have, genuinely. There's a part of me that knows the rational versions of the explanation, that runs them through periodically like a machine testing for acceptable outputs. Another hiker who happened to be camped nearby, sound traveling strangely along the creek. My own breath reflected back by the rainfly. I can construct those explanations. I can hold them in my head. What I can't do is make myself believe them, because I was there, and the weight of the breathing on the other side of that thin nylon wall did not belong to any version of the story I'm willing to tell myself. That section of trail still runs through my mind sometimes. Late at night, the light through the pines, the smell of cold creek water, the amber leaves going brown in the October air. It's a beautiful stretch of country. It was beautiful even then. But there was something in those trees that knew I was there long before I knew it, and it followed me for reasons I will never fully understand. And it stood outside my tent in the dark and breathed slow and steady until it was satisfied with something I cannot name. I've never gone back. I don't think I will. Some places carry a quality of attention that doesn't fade with distance or time, a feeling of being held in someone's awareness long after you've left the landscape that contained them. I feel it sometimes even now. That stillness, that patience. Whatever was standing in the tree line that afternoon, it wasn't in a hurry. It knew, the way that things without urgency always seem to know, that sooner or later the waiting would be enough. My cousin Dale and I had been planning that hunting trip since the previous winter. We do it every year first week of November, white-tailed deer season, up into the mountains of Polk County, where his family has had informal access to a few thousand acres of private timberland for as long as anyone can remember. The landowner is an old man named Ferris, who lives in town and doesn't use the property himself anymore. He just asks that we close the gates and don't leave a mess. We'd hunted that land 6 or 7 times over the years and knew it reasonably well, knew where the deer trails crossed the creek bottoms, knew which ridges held food sources late in the season, knew the general shape of the terrain well enough to move through it in the dark without getting turned around. What we didn't know, or hadn't known until that second morning, was what was sitting back in the timber on the upper end of the property. We'd parked at the usual pull-off and split up before first light, agreeing to meet back at the truck by noon. I'd worked my way up a ridge to the east without seeing much, and had come back down early, cutting across the upper end of the property through a stretch I didn't usually walk. The logging road up there had been reclaimed almost completely by the forest. You could see the original cut in the way the trees grew, younger and closer together in a corridor roughly wide enough for a vehicle, but the surface itself was buried under 15 years of leaf litter and encroaching brush. I was following it loosely, using it more as a reference line than an actual path, when I saw the roof line. It was set back maybe 40 yards from the road, half swallowed by a stand of young poplar that had grown up around it so thoroughly that from any other angle you probably wouldn't have seen it at all. A small structure, 1 room, maybe 2, with a tin roof gone orange with rust and walls of rough-cut board that had weathered to the color of old bone. There was no path leading to it, no clearing around it. Whatever had once connected it to the logging road had been completely erased by time and vegetation. I stood there looking at it for a moment, then texted Dale to come find me. While I waited, I studied the cabin from where I stood, looking for signs of structural collapse or active use. The roof looked intact. The walls were upright. There were no vehicles, no equipment, no power lines running in from anywhere. When Dale arrived 15 minutes later, we stood together at the edge of the road and looked at it without speaking for a little while, the way you do when something doesn't fit the landscape and you're trying to decide what to make of it. Dale said he'd never seen it before. I believed him. It was the kind of structure that you'd have no reason to know about unless you walked exactly this stretch, on exactly this bearing, which neither of us apparently ever had. We walked to it through the young poplars, pushing through the brush, and I noticed as we got closer that the ground around the cabin was not as undisturbed as I'd expected. There were areas where the leaf litter had been compressed or moved. Not a clear path, but a suggestion of repeated movement, the way a game trail looks before it becomes definite. We stopped at the door. It was a plain wooden door with a simple latch, no padlock, no hasp. Dale lifted the latch and pushed it open. The smell that came out was what I noticed first. Stale air. Yes, the sealed, still air of a space that hadn't been ventilated in days, but underneath it something else. Something organic and lived in. The specific smell of a space where a human body has been present recently and consistently. Not unwashed exactly, just human, dense and close, and unmistakably present even in the cold November air. The inside was a single room, maybe 12 by 14 feet. A wood stove against the far wall with a cast iron pan sitting on top of it. I crossed to the stove and held my hand over the pan without touching it. The grease in the bottom was soft, not liquid, not congealed solid the way it gets after days, but soft and slightly glossy, the way it looks a few hours after cooking. I looked at Dale. He'd seen it too. There was a small table near the stove with a single tin cup on it, and beside the cup a folded piece of cloth I didn't examine closely. A cot in the corner with a frame of rough wood and a surface of old canvas, blankets piled on it in the twisted, thrown-back way that suggested someone had gotten up quickly, rather than made the bed or even folded back the covers with any deliberateness. A few wooden crates stacked against one wall, a kerosene lantern hanging from a ceiling beam, the reservoir still carrying fuel. I could smell it faintly when I stood beneath it. We should have left. I want to be clear that I knew that, even then. The signs of recent habitation were plain enough that there was no rational argument for staying. Whoever lived here, or stayed here, or used this place for whatever purpose they used it for had been here within the last several hours. We were trespassing in the most literal sense, standing uninvited inside someone's occupied space. The right thing to do was to back out, close the door, and walk away. Instead, Dale walked around the end of the cot, and then he stopped moving. I came around beside him to see what he was looking at, and felt the floor of my stomach drop out in a way that had nothing to do with fear yet, and everything to do with the particular unease that comes from encountering something your brain cannot immediately categorize. The wall behind the cot, the full wall, floor to ceiling, the entire surface of rough gray boards was covered in marks. Tally marks scratched into the wood with something sharp and narrow, a nail or a knife point or something similar. They were grouped in the traditional sets of 5, 4 vertical lines with a diagonal slash across them, arranged in rough rows that covered every available inch of the wall's surface from the baseboard to where the wall met the ceiling beam. There were hundreds of them, more than hundreds. The rows at the top were cramped and uneven, as if the counter had run out of room and kept going anyway, squeezing the later marks into whatever space remained. I stood there and tried to count the groups, and gave up somewhere around 200 sets, somewhere past 1,000 individual marks. Whatever was being tallied, it had been tallied obsessively, over a long period, with a consistency and regularity that implied a kind of ritual. Days, I thought first. But 1,000 days was nearly 3 years, and the cabin didn't look like the product of 3 years of continuous occupation. And something about the groupings felt off, not quite regular enough for days, not patterned in a way I could identify as weeks or months or any other standard unit of time. Dale leaned in close to the wall near the cot. When he straightened up, he said, very quietly, that the marks near the bottom were old, the wood around them darkened and smooth, but the marks near the top, the ones crammed into the last available space near the ceiling beam, were pale and raw-edged. The wood fibers still light-colored where they'd been cut. Recent. He said it again. Recent. Not as in last year, as in last week, maybe less. I was still processing that when I heard the sound from outside. It came from the direction of the tree line beyond the cabin's back wall, maybe 50 or 60 yards away, and at first I genuinely couldn't identify it. A low sound, continuous, without melody or rhythm. A humming, I realized after a moment, but tuneless, in a way that made the word feel insufficient. It wasn't music. It wasn't an expression of contentment or distraction the way humming usually is. It was more like the sound a person makes when they are engaged in something that requires no thought, something so habitual and automatic that vocalization just happens alongside it without intention. It was coming closer, slowly, but without hesitation, moving through the brush toward the cabin with a steadiness that implied familiarity with the terrain. Dale and I did not discuss it. There was no conversation, no exchange look that led to a decision. We were simply moving out from behind the cot, across the room, through the door, in the same motion that pulled it mostly shut behind us, through the young poplars, with branches catching at our sleeves and our packs, back to the logging road, and then along it, at a pace that was not quite running, but was everything short of it. We didn't slow down until we'd covered a quarter mile and the road had curved enough that the cabin's roofline was no longer visible behind us. We stopped then, both breathing harder than the terrain warranted, and listened. The humming had stopped, or it hadn't reached us, or the distance and the trees had swallowed it. There was nothing now but wind moving through the upper canopy, and the distant sound of a woodpecker working a dead snag somewhere on the ridge above us. We walked back to the truck without speaking. Dale drove the first several miles down the mountain road before either of us said anything. When he finally spoke, he said that the marks on the wall near the ceiling looked fresh, pale wood, clean cuts, no oxidation. I said I knew. He said he thought whoever made them had been there within the last few days. I said I knew that too. We didn't talk about the sound. We didn't try to explain it or attribute it to anything. Some things, when you try to put them into ordinary language, become smaller than they actually were, and neither of us wanted that. I've turned the tallies over in my mind more times than I can count since that November. I've tried every framework I can think of: days of isolation, occurrences of something seen or heard, a record of something taken or given or done. None of them settle right. None of them account for the particular quality of obsession in those marks, the way they filled every inch of available space and kept going, cramming into the margins when the room ran out, refusing to stop. Whatever was being counted mattered enormously to whoever was counting it. The counting itself seemed to matter, the physical act of making the mark, of recording that another unit of something had passed or occurred or been survived. Old Man Ferris died the following spring. The property passed to a nephew who lives out of state and has no interest in it. As far as I know, no one has walked that upper section of the timberland since Dale and I were there. I don't know if the cabin is still standing. I don't know if anyone is still in it. I don't know if the counting is still going on. I think about that sometimes, the marks near the ceiling, pale and new, pressed up against the beam with no room left. I think about what happens when you run out of wall. I've lived in Haywood County my entire life. 31 years in the same county, 22 of them in the same house my father built on a 2-acre lot outside of Canton, close enough to the mountains that on clear mornings you can see the ridgeline from the kitchen window. I know these roads the way you know the inside of your own house, not by thinking about them, but by feel, by the automatic knowledge of where they bend and where they flatten, and where the pavement gets narrow enough that you ease toward the center line without deciding to. I know which stretches flood in heavy rain and which hilltops lose cell signal and which pull-offs the county uses for equipment storage. I know this country. I want you to understand that before I tell you what I saw on the Crusoe Road that October evening, because the knowing matters. What I saw wasn't the product of unfamiliarity or disorientation, or a mind working too hard in a landscape it didn't understand. I was on a road I'd driven since before I had a license, in a county I've never left for longer than 2 weeks in my entire life, and what I saw was wrong in a way that the familiarity made worse, not better. I'd spent the afternoon at my Uncle Roy's place over toward Bethel, helping him restack a woodpile that had come down in a windstorm the week before. We worked until the light started going and then sat on his porch for an hour after, drinking coffee and talking about nothing in particular the way you do with family when there's no agenda and nowhere to be. I left his place around 6:30, maybe 6:45. The sky still held a thin gray light at the ridgeline to the west, but the valley was already dark, the kind of early full dark that comes to these mountain coves in October once the sun drops behind the high ground. I could have taken the highway back. It would have been faster by 15 minutes and better lit by a significant margin. But I'd been taking the Crusoe Road home from Roy's place since I was a teenager, and I liked it. Liked the way it followed the creek bottom through that long stretch of second-growth timber, liked the absence of traffic and signage, and the particular quality of quiet that comes from a road that goes nowhere most people need to be. It's the kind of road that feels like it belongs to you when you're on it. I've always found that restful. I was maybe 4 miles into that timber stretch, moving at a comfortable 40 miles an hour with the windows cracked to let in the cold air, when my headlights picked it up. It was on the right shoulder of the road, maybe 50 yards ahead, low to the ground and moving fast, moving across the road, from the ditch on the right toward the ditch on the left, with a speed and directness that my brain initially filed as dog. The size supported it. The general shape and peripheral processing supported it. But in the 2 or 3 seconds that my headlights held it fully before it reached the far ditch, something in the movement wouldn't resolve into anything I had a file for. It was low, yes, close to the ground, the way a dog is close to the ground, but the mechanics of the movement were wrong. The limbs were too long. The joints were bending in a configuration that I couldn't map onto any 4-legged animal I knew, and I knew the animals of these mountains well enough to know their gaits, the specific rhythm of how they move when they're moving fast. A deer runs differently than a coyote runs differently than a bear moves when it's startled into speed. Each one has a signature. This had none of those signatures. What it had instead was something closer to the movement of a person. The suggestion of arms and legs, rather than 4 legs arranged in a configuration that shouldn't have been able to achieve the speed it was achieving. It dropped into the far ditch and was gone before I could process what I'd decided about it. I let off the gas. The truck slowed. I should have let it keep slowing until I was moving again, until the road carried me past that spot and into the next mile and eventually out of the timber and back toward Canton and home. My foot found the brake instead. The truck stopped. I sat with the engine idling and the headlights cutting into the dark ahead of me, illuminating the empty road and the ditch line on the left and the tree line beyond it. And I told myself I was looking to see if whatever it was had been hit, if I'd clipped it without feeling it, if there was an injured animal in the ditch I needed to account for. That's what I told myself. I'm not certain it was true. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, watching the ditch and the tree line. There was nothing. No movement, no sound I could hear over the engine. No shape in the darkness that resolved into anything identifiable. I had my hand on the gear shift and was about to put it in drive when the shape appeared at the tree line. It was standing upright. That's what I need you to understand, not crouched, not transitioning, but fully upright, the way a person stands when they're standing still. It was at the edge of the tree line, maybe 15 yards past the ditch, in the narrow zone where my headlights still reached but barely, where everything exists at the edge of definition, and your eyes have to work to pull detail from the dark. What I could see was height. It was tall, taller than a person of average height, by enough that the difference was unmistakable, even at distance and in bad light and stillness. It was completely still in the way that something is still when it is paying attention. Not the frozen stillness of a startled animal about to bolt. The settled, deliberate stillness of something that had chosen to stop moving and was now doing something else. Looking, I realized. It was looking at the truck, at the headlights, maybe, or through them, or at the cab, or at me specifically. I couldn't know which. Couldn't see a face or eyes, or any feature that would have let me know where its attention was directed. But the orientation of the shape was toward me, squared toward the road and the truck, and it was not moving, and it was not leaving. It was considering. That's the word I keep coming back to, years later, when I try to describe the quality of attention I felt coming from that tree line. It was considering the truck, or me, or the situation, the way you consider something when you haven't decided yet what to do about it. There was something cognitive in the stillness, something that felt too deliberate to be instinct. I put the truck in reverse. I didn't turn around. There wasn't room, and turning around would have meant taking my eyes off the tree line, and I found I was completely unwilling to do that. I reversed down that road with my head twisted over my left shoulder, and my eyes cutting back to the rear window and then forward to the tree line every few seconds, watching that shape in my headlights get smaller as I put distance between us. It didn't move. For the entire quarter-mile, I reversed down that road before I found a wide spot to turn in. It stood exactly where it had appeared, at the edge of the trees, upright and still, watching me go. When I finally got turned around and my headlights swung away from that section of tree line, I put my foot on the accelerator, and I did not lift it until I was back on the highway. I called Roy when I got home, told him what I'd seen without editorializing, just the facts of it as plainly as I could state them. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked me exactly where on the Crusoe road it had happened. I described the location as best I could, the approximate mileage, the general character of the timber on that stretch. He was quiet again. Then he said that there was an old home place back in the timber on that section, long abandoned, that had been occupied by a family named Prater up until sometime in the late 70s or early 80s, when the county had gotten involved, for reasons he said he didn't fully know, but that his own father had spoken about in terms that suggested something had gone very wrong in that hollow over a long period of time. He said some of those old home places, when families lived on them long enough and went isolated enough, produced things that were hard to account for in ordinary terms. He said it the way old men in these mountains say things like that matter-of-factly, without drama, as if he were telling me about a soil condition or a weather pattern, just a thing that was known. I didn't ask him to explain further. I'm not sure I wanted him to. I still drive the Crusoe road. I said I would always drive it before dark now, and that's been true. I've kept to that without making a formal rule of it, just a quiet rearrangement of my habits that I don't discuss with anyone. I leave Roy's place earlier now, or I take the highway if the timing is wrong. It's a small adjustment. Most people who know me wouldn't notice it. But sometimes I'm on that road in the last good light before dusk, moving through that timber stretch with the windows down and the creek running alongside, and something tightens in me as I approach that section. Some low-level physiological awareness that the body holds on to long after the mind has filed the event away and moved on. My speed drops. My hands shift on the wheel. My eyes go to the ditches and the tree line without instruction from anywhere I can consciously identify. And, I think about how fast it was moving when it crossed the road. Low to the ground, arms and legs working in that wrong rhythm, covering that distance in a way that suggested practice, as if moving like that was not an aberration but a preference, a chosen mode, something it returned to when it didn't need to be anything else. I think about how quickly it went from that to standing upright, fully upright, composed and still, like the transition required no effort at all. I think about what it was doing in those seconds before I reversed down the road. What it was deciding, what the outcome of that decision might have looked like if I'd sat there any longer, or if I'd gotten out to look in the ditch, or if I'd been on foot instead of in a truck with an engine running and a gear shift under my hand. I don't let myself finish that line of thinking. Some questions are better left where they live. In the dark at the edge of a road you drive before sundown now, always before sundown, without ever fully explaining to anyone why. My grandfather put a deer stand in that ridge the year my father was born. That's how he always told it, not as a boast but as a coordinate, a way of fixing the thing in time the way you'd fix a landmark on a map. The stand itself had been replaced twice since then, the original rot-soft platform giving way to a rebuilt version in the late 80s, and then to the lock-on stand I was using by the time I was old enough to hunt it myself. But the tree was the same tree, a massive white oak on the spine of a ridge in Yancey County that my grandfather had chosen because it gave a clean view down both slopes, and because the deer, for reasons that had held consistent across 4 decades, moved through the hollow below it every November morning like clockwork. He'd taken more deer from that stand than he could accurately count. My father had taken several. I'd taken 3 in the years since my grandfather had handed the lease over to me, along with the general stewardship of a piece of country that our family had hunted longer than I'd been alive. I knew that land the way you know a place that has been described to you in detail before you ever walked it yourself. My grandfather talked about it the way some men talk about people they love, specifically, tenderly, with the accumulated knowledge of long attention. He knew which draws held water in dry years, and which ran mud in wet ones. He knew where the old railroad grade cut across the lower end of the property and where the boundary lines ran and where the laurel hells got thick enough to turn you around if you weren't paying attention. By the time I started hunting it myself, I had inherited not just the lease, but the entire geography of his understanding. And walking into those woods felt less like exploring than like moving through a space I already knew in my bones. So when I settled into that stand on the first Saturday of November, in the last full dark before the sky began to change, I was not a stranger in that hollow. I was as known to that country as a person can be to a piece of ground they didn't grow up on. That matters. It matters because what I heard and what I saw that morning wasn't filtered through unfamiliarity or disorientation. I heard it and saw it with 30 years of that landscape behind my eyes, and it was wrong in a way that the familiarity made absolute. I'd climbed in around 5:15, well before first light, and settled into the stand the way you settle into something practiced weight distributed, rifle across my knees, the cold seeping through my base layers in the gradual way that you learn to accept rather than resist. The hollow below the ridge was completely black, the laurel and the creek bottom invisible beneath the canopy, the only sounds, the occasional drip of condensation from the oak branches above me, and the distant complaint of a barred owl somewhere on the next ridge over. By 5:40 the owl had gone quiet, and the woods were in that particular pre-dawn stillness that experienced hunters know the held breath interval between the night sounds stopping and the day sounds beginning, when the forest seems to be waiting for something to tip the balance. The sound started at 6, maybe 6:05. The sky had begun to gray at the eastern ridgeline, just the first dilution of the dark, not enough to see by, but enough to know that seeing was coming. The sound came from the hollow below, roughly 300 yards down the slope from where I sat, and at first, I couldn't place it. Low and wet and irregular, with a rhythm that suggested organic process rather than mechanical source. My mind ran through the catalog automatically: coyote, most likely, given the time and location and the season, possibly working on a gut pile from an early morning kill. I'd heard coyotes on carcasses before. The sounds they make are not pleasant, but they're identifiable. I identified this as that and let it settle. But the sound continued, and as the light slowly built, I found I was listening to it more carefully than I'd intended to. The way you listen to something when a low-level part of your brain has registered a discrepancy that the conscious part hasn't caught up to yet. It wasn't resolving into coyote the way it should have. The rhythms were wrong. Coyotes on a kill are chaotic and vocal. They whine and snarl, and the sounds overlap and interrupt each other in a way that's almost social. This was different. Steadier, more deliberate. More than one source, I realized after a few minutes, but the sources weren't competing with each other. They were working in proximity with a kind of tolerance that suggested awareness and coordination. The light came up slowly, the way it does in a deep hollow in November, the sky brightening by degrees, while the ground below stayed dark for a long time after. By 6:30, I had enough light to see the slope below me in rough terms, the gray shapes of tree trunks, the mass of the laurel, the suggestion of the creek line at the bottom, and in the hollow, down in the laurel where the light was still uncertain, I could see movement. There were at least 3 of them. I say at least because the laurel obscured enough of the hollow that I can't be certain I was seeing all of what was there. What I could see was 3 areas of movement, low to the ground, gathered close together around something I couldn't identify in the dim. Something on the ground between them, something that wasn't moving. The figures were, and the word I keep coming back to is wrong. Their movement was wrong in the specific way that a person's movement is wrong when they are on all fours. When the human body is arranged in a configuration it can achieve, but wasn't designed for. Not the fluid wrongness of the thing I've heard other people describe, the uncanny valley of something almost human. This was more fundamental. The wrongness of seeing a human shape in an animal posture, and understanding that the posture is chosen and practiced and comfortable. I raised my rifle. Not to shoot, the thought didn't occur to me in any conscious way. I raised it because the scope gave me magnification, and the magnification gave me definition in the low light, and some part of me needed to see more clearly what I was seeing. I found the figures in the scope and held there and watched, and the sound continued the whole time, that low, wet sound, and I looked at what was on the ground between them, and I made a decision not to decide what it was, and I lowered the rifle. My grandfather had told me once that the hollow below that stand had been a settlement in the previous century, not a prosperous one, just a cluster of families that had moved into the creek bottom sometime before the Civil War, and had stayed through the timber cuts, and the Depression, and several other things that emptied out most of the small settlements in those mountains. He said they'd stayed long enough and gone isolated enough that by the time anyone from the county had regular contact with them again, the contact had been difficult. He'd said that word difficult in a way that I hadn't pressed him on. I thought about that word now, in the stand, with the sound coming up from the hollow and the shapes moving down in the laurel. I did not move for over an hour. I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't purely strategic. It wasn't purely the reasoned decision of a hunter who knew that stillness was safety. Part of it was something more animal than reason, the understanding, arrived at below the level of conscious thought, that the figures in the hollow below me had not looked up yet, and that the distance between that state of affairs and some other state of affairs was something I had influence over by remaining completely still and completely quiet, and that I was not willing to do anything that might change it. The hollow went still a few minutes before 8. The sound stopped, and the movement stopped, and the figures, I watched them go, one at a time, back into the laurel on the far side of the creek, moving low and efficient through the brush until the laurel closed behind them and there was nothing left to see. I waited another 15 minutes after the last one disappeared before I climbed down from the stand. I did it carefully, quietly, with the full attention of a man who is doing something that matters. I left everything. My grunt call hanging on the hook, my extra ammunition, the small pack I'd carried up with my food and water and rain gear. I left all of it, and I walked out of those woods at a pace that was not running, because running felt like it would have been the wrong kind of movement in that air, in that silence, in that particular quality of post-event stillness that had settled over the hollow. I drove to my grandfather's house in the early afternoon. He was on his porch when I pulled up, the way he almost always was in daylight hours, and he looked at me for a long moment before I'd said anything, and I could see in his face that he'd already begun to understand that something had shifted. I told him what I'd heard first, then what I'd seen. I described the location, the hollow below the stand, the laurel thicket, the creek bottom and the movement, and the sound and the figures, and the thing on the ground that I still hadn't let myself name. He listened without interrupting, which was not unusual for him, but the quality of his listening was different than usual. He was very still. When I finished, he looked out at the ridgeline visible from his porch and was quiet for a time that I didn't try to fill. Then he said, "There's always been people in those hollows that don't come out." He said it the way you'd say something that had been true for a long time and that you'd long since made a kind of peace with. Not resigned, not frightened, just settled, The way old men in these mountains sometimes are about things that younger men would need to turn into a problem or a story or an explanation. He'd known about the hollow, or known something about it, for 40 years of hunting that ridge, and he'd never told me, and I understood from the way he said it that he hadn't told me because there was nothing useful to tell. Some knowledge doesn't make the thing safer or more manageable. Some knowledge is just weight. I haven't been back to that stand. The lease comes up for renewal every 3 years and I've let it lapse. I told the landowner it was a matter of time, which is true in the way that most half-truths are true. My grandfather died 2 winters ago, and with him went whatever fuller understanding he'd carried about that hollow and the people in it, if understanding is even the right word for what he had. Maybe it was just familiarity. Maybe he'd simply known, for a long time, that the hollow held something he'd chosen to leave alone, and had hunted the ridge above it for 40 years without looking down too carefully, without listening too closely, and had lived a long and full life in the particular peace that comes from knowing exactly which things you've decided not to know. I think about the sounds still. Early mornings, in the interval before full waking, when the mind is loose enough to let things in that the day keeps out. That low, wet, deliberate sound coming up through 300 yards of cold November air. The figures gathered close and low around what was on the ground between them. I made a decision in that stand not to let myself name what I was seeing. I've kept to that decision. Some things you leave unnamed on purpose, because the name would require you to carry it somewhere, and there's nowhere to carry it that doesn't change the weight of everything else. The summer I turned 23, I took a seasonal position with a trail maintenance crew working out of the Nantahala National Forest. It wasn't glamorous work, it wasn't meant to be. 8 hours a day of clearing blowdowns, rehabbing eroded tread, resetting water bars and drainage structures on trails that saw enough foot traffic to need constant attention but not enough budget to get it consistently. The pay was modest and the hours were long, and by the end of each day my hands were so tired that opening a food container felt like a meaningful physical challenge. I loved it completely. I was 23. I was outside every day in one of the most beautiful pieces of forest in the eastern United States, and I was sleeping in a tent in the mountains for 3 weeks straight with 5 other people who had self-selected for exactly this kind of work. There are worse ways to spend a summer. Our camp was set at the end of a forest road that the crew foreman, a compact and unhurried man named Ellis, who had been doing this work for going on 20 years, described on the first day as accessible in the technical sense of the word. What he meant was that a high-clearance vehicle could reach it under dry conditions without sustaining obvious damage, and that this condition applied to roughly 2/3 of the summer season. The other third, when the road washed out as it apparently did every spring without fail and often enough in summer cloudbursts, we were back in there without a practical exit, short of a 4-mile walk to the nearest paved surface. He said this matter-of-factly, the way he said most things, and nobody on the crew treated it as a concern. We were there for the work. The isolation was part of the arrangement. We were 6 in total: Ellis, myself, 2 guys named Marcus and Porter who'd worked together the previous season and had the easy shorthand of people who'd already figured each other out, a quiet woman named Drew, who was faster with a Pulaski than anyone I'd worked with before or since, and a younger kid, maybe 19, named Colt, who was on his first season and still in the phase of learning that enthusiasm is not the same thing as efficiency. We set up camp the first afternoon, got the cook area established, and the tents arranged in a rough arc around the fire ring, and by the second day had fallen into the rhythm that Ellis said always came by the second day if the crew was worth anything. Early light, coffee, tool assignment, 6 hours of work with a midday break, 2 more hours, back to camp, food, fire, sleep. The forest around us was dense second growth, with some significant old timber on the upper slopes, rhododendron and dog hobble choking the creek drainages. The trail we were working cutting through terrain that was steep enough to make every task take longer than it looked like it should on paper. It was Colt who mentioned the child first. He brought it up at breakfast on the 8th or 9th day, casually, the way you mention something that you've already decided has a reasonable explanation. He said he'd seen a kid at the edge of camp the night before, standing just past the firelight on the south side, near where the camp gave way to a stand of young hemlocks. He'd assumed it was someone from a family campsite down the road. There were designated sites a couple of miles back, and it wasn't inconceivable that a kid would wander, though it was late and the distance was not trivial. He'd thought about calling out and decided against it, figured the kid would head back on their own. When he looked again a few minutes later, the spot was empty. Nobody said much about it. Marcus made a comment about parents needing to keep better track, and the conversation moved on. Ellis, I noticed, didn't say anything at all. He just refilled his coffee and looked at the fire ring for a moment before standing up and announcing tool assignments for the day. I filed it away without filing it as anything significant. I saw the child myself the following night. I was on the late side of the fire, which happens sometimes. I've always slept lightly, and found that exhaustion of the physical kind produces a strange alertness in the hour or two before it finally takes me under, a window of heightened sensory awareness that I've come to associate with outdoor work. The others had gone to their tents. Ellis was still up, sitting across the fire from me, but he'd been quiet for 20 minutes, and I thought he might be close to turning in. I was looking at the fire in the unfocused way you look at fire when you're not thinking about anything in particular, and motion at the edge of my vision pulled my eyes left. The child was standing at the margin of the firelight on the south side of camp, in almost exactly the spot Colt had described. Small, 8 or 9 years old was my instinctive read, though something about the proportions made the estimate feel slightly uncertain, as if the scale of the figure didn't map cleanly onto the ages I had reference points for. Bare feet in the mud and leaf litter, which I registered immediately because the night was cold, genuinely cold for July at that elevation, cold enough that I was wearing a fleece over my base layer. The clothing was what held my attention second, a kind of shapeless dress or long shirt in a dull, faded color. The specific quality of fade that comes not from modern washing but from age, from fabric that has been worn and worn until the original color is a memory. The cloth barely holds. It was wrong for the weather and wrong for the era in a way I couldn't have articulated precisely, but felt with complete certainty, like something out of a photograph from a period before color film. The child was looking at the fire. I said, "Hey," not loudly, a conversational volume, the way you'd address someone you weren't sure had seen you. The child didn't respond, didn't look at me, didn't move, just continued looking at the fire with an expression I couldn't read at that distance and in that light. I was aware of Ellis across the fire, but I didn't look at him. I stood up slowly, the way you move when you don't want to startle something, and took 2 steps toward the child. They turned and walked into the hemlocks. Not quickly, not in the sudden way of something frightened into flight. Deliberately, at an ordinary walking pace, without looking back. The hemlocks were dense enough that a person moving through them should have produced noise, the spring and rustle of branches, the crunch of the accumulated duff on the ground beneath them. There was nothing. The child was there, and then the child was in the trees, and then the child was gone, and the forest received them without a sound, without a movement, without any evidence that the boundary between the firelight and the dark had been crossed by anything at all. I stood at the edge of the hemlock stand for a moment, looking into the dark between the trunks. There was nothing to see. No light, no movement, no sound of retreating footsteps or snapping brush. I turned back to the fire and found Ellis watching me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. Not fear exactly, but a careful attention. The look of someone who has been waiting to see how something unfolds. I sat back down. He didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. We sat with the fire between us for a few minutes, and then I told him what I'd just seen, flatly and in order, without interpretation. When I finished, he was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not respond at all. Then he said, "Keep the fire going all night, every night. From here on, don't let it go to coals if you're the last one up. And don't walk toward the tree line after dark, no matter what you see there." I asked him why. He looked at the fire for a moment, and then he looked at me, and he said it was just a precaution. His voice was level, and his face was composed, and both of those things told me more than the words did, because Ellis was a man whose levelness was a practiced and deliberate thing, a quality he maintained with intention, and beneath it, in that moment, I could see the maintenance required. This was not new information for him. He had been here before, in this specific understanding, and had arranged himself around it in the way that people arrange themselves around things they've decided to manage rather than resolve. I said, "Okay." I meant it. There are moments when you understand that the information available to you is all the information you're going to get, and that the appropriate response is to work within it rather than push against it. I kept the fire that night until the sky began to change, feeding it steadily, watching the tree line on the south side of camp with the particular quality of attention that is not quite fear, but lives close to it. Nothing appeared. The hemlocks were dark and still and ordinary looking, in the way that things look ordinary when you're watching them hard enough. For the remaining 2 weeks, I followed Ellis's instructions without variation. I kept the fire. I didn't approach the tree line after dark. 3 more times over those 2 weeks, I saw the child always on the south side of camp, always at the margin of the firelight, always barefoot, always in those wrong clothes, always looking at the fire rather than at me or at anyone else in the camp. Twice I was the only one awake to see it. Once Marcus was still up, and I watched him see it too, watched his posture change across the fire, and we looked at each other, and then back at the tree line, and neither of us spoke about it that night or the following morning, or at any point for the rest of the season. The last night of our time at that camp, I stayed up until nearly 4 in the morning. The child appeared around 2. Same location, same posture, same attention directed at the fire. I sat across the ring and watched them watch the flames for a long time, longer than any of the previous appearances. Long enough that I began to feel something that wasn't fear and wasn't pity, but carried elements of both. There was something in the quality of attention directed at that fire that felt like longing, like looking at something from a great distance that you remember being closer to. I don't know if that's the right way to describe it. I'm not sure I have the right words for any of it. When I looked up from the fire, the spot was empty. The hemlocks were dark and still. I fed the last of the wood onto the fire and watched it catch, and sat with it until the gray light came. I never asked Ellis what he knew. I composed the question a dozen times over those final 2 weeks, and each time I let it go, understanding that whatever answer he had was one he'd chosen not to give, and that the choice had been made for reasons I should probably respect. He's been doing this work for 20 years in these mountains. He's camped in a lot of places that most people never see. Some of those places, I think, he's developed an understanding of that lives outside ordinary categories of explanation, and he carries that understanding the way you carry a tool that you use rarely but that you're glad to have when you need it. I've thought about those bare feet in the cold mud more than I've thought about most things from that summer. The ground at elevation in July, after dark, is cold in a way that you feel immediately and adjust to slowly. Whatever that child was, whatever state of being produced, those appearances at the edge of our firelight for 3 weeks, they were standing in that cold without apparent discomfort, without shoes, looking at a fire that was not their fire, in clothes from a time that was not this time, looking at the warmth from outside it, night after night, at the edge of the light, looking at the warmth from outside it. I've never found a way to make that thought lie flat and stay there. I don't expect I will. Kevin had inherited the land from his great-uncle, a man he'd met maybe 4 times in his life, and remembered mainly as a large, quiet presence at family reunions who didn't drink and didn't talk much and left early. The great-uncle had lived alone on a small parcel in Jackson County, and had apparently purchased the Swain County tract sometime in the late 70s as a timber investment that he'd never acted on, just held and paid taxes on for 40 years until he died, and left the whole thing to Kevin, because Kevin was the only member of the family who'd ever expressed any interest in land. The bequest came with no documentation beyond the deed, and no explanation beyond a single line in the will that Kevin's attorney had read to him over the phone. Held in good faith, leave it as you found it. Kevin had called me 2 weeks after the estate settled. I was the person he called for things like this. I'd done some timber cruising work in my 20s and still knew enough about evaluating standing timber and terrain to be useful on a walkthrough. And I had the kind of schedule that allowed for a weekday in the woods without much advanced planning. We drove up on a Thursday in late September, parked at the end of a gated forest road that bordered the property on its eastern edge, and went in on foot with a property map Kevin had printed from the county GIS system and a compass I trusted more than either of our phones. The land was good in the way that old unmanaged hardwood is good, messy, and various, and full of the kind of biological complexity that takes decades of non-intervention to develop. The lower slopes held a mix of tulip poplar and red oak, with some significant black cherry in the coves, the kind of timber that a logger would look at with genuine interest. The terrain got steeper as we moved uphill, the soil thinner, the composition shifting toward chestnut oak and hickory on the drier aspects, and then into hemlock on the north-facing slopes near the upper boundary. We'd been walking for about 2 hours, covering the lower and middle portions of the property in a loose grid when we pushed into the hemlock stand on the upper end. Hemlocks change the character of a forest the way few other trees do. The canopy closes differently. The light goes flat and indirect. The understory drops away because almost nothing grows under them, and the ground becomes a soft, uniform layer of accumulated needles that absorbs sound in a way that makes the silence qualitatively different from the silence in hardwood. We'd been in the hemlocks for maybe 10 minutes, moving uphill through the dim, when Kevin stopped walking. I came up beside him and saw the tree. It was a white oak, a massive one, the kind that doesn't belong in a hemlock stand and probably predated it by a century, a remnant of whatever the forest had been before the hemlocks moved in and changed the terms. The trunk was easily 4 feet in diameter at chest height, the bark deeply furrowed and dark with moisture, the lower branches beginning maybe 30 feet up and spreading from there into a canopy that interrupted the hemlock ceiling like a different sky. It was the kind of tree that commands attention on its own terms, that you'd notice and stop to look at regardless of what was in it. What was in it stopped being a background detail and became the only detail within about 3 seconds of looking. The platforms began maybe 25 feet up, above the first major branch junction, and continued upward through the canopy in a configuration I spent a long time trying to understand and couldn't fully resolve from the ground. They were built from branches, not cut lumber, not milled material of any kind, but branches of varying diameter lashed together with cordage into rough, flat surfaces that were wedged and tied into the oak's branch structure at intervals of roughly 8 to 10 vertical feet. 3 platforms that I could see clearly, possibly a 4th higher up where the canopy thickened and the light failed. The cordage was the thing I kept coming back to as I stood there looking up. It wasn't rope in any conventional sense, not nylon or manila or anything manufactured, but something twisted and organic, the color of dried grass, wound around the branch junctions in tight, practiced wraps that held everything with a security that suggested real knowledge of load and tension. I've tied enough knots in my life to recognize competent cordage work. This was competent. This had been done by someone who understood what they were building and how to make it hold. Between and around the platforms, wedged into branch junctions and lashed to upright branches with more of that cordage, were other things. Scraps of material fabric, heavy canvas, something that might have been a canvas tarp cut into sections and repurposed, draped and tied in ways that suggested wind protection, the creation of enclosed or partially enclosed spaces within the structure. And among the fabric, and along the branches themselves, and in gaps between the platform boards, other objects. I could identify some of them. Small bones, the kind that come from animals in the squirrel to rabbit size range, some of them still carrying desiccated tissue. Larger bones I couldn't place from where I stood. Pale and smooth, the surface quality of old worked bone. Clumps of fur matted, dark, still holding shape in the way fur holds shape when the grease in it hasn't fully dried out. Bits of what looked like leather or hide that had been prepared in some rough way. Feathers. A lot of feathers, tied in loose bundles and tucked into the structure at intervals. The smell reached us somewhere in the middle of all this. I don't know why it took as long as it did. Possibly we'd been upwind of the tree until we stopped directly beneath it, or possibly the cold air was suppressing it and we'd warmed it slightly with our presence. It came in on a shift of the air, and it was rancid and organic and complex in the way that the smell of decay is always complex, always carrying more information than you want to receive. It wasn't the clean smell of old bones. It was the smell of something recent enough to still be in process. I looked at Kevin. He was looking up into the canopy with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Not fear exactly, not yet, but the specific blankness of a person whose processing capacity has been temporarily exceeded by incoming information. I followed his eyes up, and then I made myself stop looking up, because something in the quality of the smell and the recentness of the fur and the construction of those platforms was producing a strong and specific instinct that looking up for too long was the wrong thing to do. Not because of what I'd see, because of what might notice me looking. I touched Kevin's arm. He looked at me. I tilted my head back toward the direction we'd come from, and he nodded immediately, and we left. We didn't discuss it, didn't whisper, Didn't do anything that produced more sound than walking as carefully as two people can walk through hemlock duff when they are motivated to be quiet. We moved downhill through the hemlocks and into the hardwood, and kept moving until we were off the property and back at Kevin's truck. And only then, with the doors closed and the engine running, did either of us speak. What I said first was practical. The cordage was new. Kevin said he'd seen that too. I said the fur hadn't dried completely, which meant whatever it had come from had been up there within days, maybe less. Kevin said he understood. I said that whoever built that structure knew what they were doing. The platforms were engineered. The lashing was deliberate. The whole thing had been constructed by someone with knowledge and intention and enough time to build something that size. Kevin said he'd been thinking about the size. 3 platforms, possibly 4, each one large enough to sleep on if you were willing to sleep curled or at an angle. The total structure, I estimated, was large enough to shelter a person indefinitely if they were comfortable at height and unbothered by exposure. I didn't say the next thing I was thinking, which was about the bones and whether any of them had been a size and shape I didn't want to assign a species to. I kept that thought where it was, and Kevin, if he'd had the same thought, kept his in the same place, and we drove back toward Bryson City without talking much about anything. Kevin listed the property with a timber broker the following spring. He priced it fairly, disclosed no issues beyond some access limitations with the road, and sold it within 60 days to a logging operation out of Buncombe County that planned to clear the lower slopes and leave the upper hemlock stand as a buffer. He told the broker it was good timberland, well held, no problems with the title. He didn't mention the tree. I've thought about that logging crew going into the upper end of the property, into the hemlocks, and what they'd find when they got to the white oak. Whether whatever had built those platforms would still be there, or whether it would have moved on by the time human activity got loud enough to push it somewhere else. Whether the great-uncle had known about the tree when he'd written, "Leave it as you found it" in his will, and what 40 years of knowing had looked like from the inside, and whether leaving it alone had been an arrangement or just a decision made once and held to out of a particular kind of mountain practicality that understands some things are better left with the terms they've established for themselves. I don't know what was living in that tree. I mean that precisely I don't know, and I've made a deliberate choice not to pursue the question past a certain point, because the information I already have is enough to understand that the answer would require me to rearrange other things I'm not ready to rearrange. What I know is that something had built a structure in a very old tree, in an unwalked corner of 1,100 acres, and had built it well, and had been there recently, and had accumulated around itself the materials of a life lived at height and in the open, away from roads and people and any of the ordinary infrastructure of human existence. What I know is that when I think about the smell, and the fur that hadn't dried, and the platforms rising through the canopy in that rough spiral, I still feel the thing I felt standing under that tree, the very specific instinct that told me, without ambiguity and without room for argument, that looking up for too long was something I would regret. I listened to that instinct. It's one of the few decisions from that day I'm entirely at peace with. My Aunt Patrice has always been the kind of woman who does things on her own terms and doesn't spend much energy explaining herself to people who wouldn't understand anyway. She moved to Gilmer County from Atlanta sometime in her mid-40s, after my uncle passed, and bought a house at the end of a gravel road outside of Ellijay that most people in the family considered an eccentric decision and eventually stopped questioning. The house was old, not dramatically old, not the kind of old that gets written about, just the ordinary old of a structure built in the early part of the previous century by people who needed shelter and built it accordingly, without ornamentation or excess. 2 stories, 4 rooms, a covered porch that faced west toward the road, and a back bedroom on the ground floor that faced east toward a tree line that began maybe 40 yards from the house and rose steeply up a ridge that was part of the Appalachian system in that particular way that the North Georgia mountains are part of it, connected, continuous, the same stone and soil and old dark forest that runs all the way up through the Carolinas and Virginia and beyond. She'd been in that house for going on 7 years by the time I stayed with her that October. I'd visited twice before, briefly, and had always found the place comfortable, in the specific way that old houses in the country are comfortable. Worn surfaces and good light, and the absence of the ambient noise that you stop noticing in towns until it's gone. The visit that weekend was practical rather than social. Her furnace had gone out and the repair was scheduled for Monday. And the nights in that part of Georgia in late October get cold enough that my mother had called and asked me to go stay with her through the weekend, rather than let her manage alone. I was between things at the time and had no good reason to decline. I arrived Friday afternoon and we had a pleasant enough evening dinner, conversation, the kind of catching up that happens in families when you see someone regularly enough that there's no dramatic news, but infrequently enough that the ordinary accumulation of life provides sufficient material. Patrice seemed well. She seemed settled in the particular way that people who've made a decision and stopped second-guessing it are settled at home, in herself, and in the house, and in the choice she'd made to be there. We stayed up until maybe 10, and then she went to bed, and I took the back bedroom, which she'd made up with extra blankets against the cold. And I read for an hour before turning out the light sometime around 11. The bedroom faced the tree line. I noticed it absently when I'd first put my bag down the window, above the narrow desk against the east wall, looking out at 40 yards of open ground, and then the woods beginning. The trees dark masses against a sky that still held some ambient light from somewhere, the ridgeline above them a slightly lighter dark against the dark. It was the kind of view that reads as peaceful in daylight and as something more ambiguous after dark, when the tree line becomes a boundary rather than a landscape feature, a place where visibility ends and whatever is beyond it becomes a matter of inference rather than observation. I didn't think about it particularly. I turned out the light and went to sleep. The first knock woke me completely, the way a loud and sudden sound in a quiet house wakes you, not gradually, not with the slow surfacing of normal waking, but all at once, sitting up in the dark with my heart already going and my mind already trying to identify what had pulled me out of sleep before I was fully aware of being awake. 3 knocks. I knew that immediately. Before I'd consciously processed it, the number and rhythm were already in my mind as a complete unit, a piece of information my sleeping brain had received and held until the conscious part could catch up. 3 knocks on the exterior wall of the bedroom, the wall beside the window that faced the tree line, with a weight and spacing that was neither fast nor slow, but deliberate. The spacing between them was consistent, not the random intervals of a branch in wind, not the organic irregularity of any settling or thermal contraction I'd ever heard a house make. Even and measured and patient, in a way that the body registers before the mind articulates. I sat in the dark and told myself branch. I told myself the roof, the porch structure, a raccoon, any of the things that make sounds against houses at night and turn out to be nothing. I was moderately convincing for about 45 seconds, which is how long it took for the knocking to come again. Same rhythm, same spacing, same deliberate weight, as if whatever was producing it understood not just the physical mechanics of knocking, but the communicative intent behind it, the specific pattern that means I am here, I am outside, I am waiting for a response. 3 knocks with that measured interval between them, and then silence. And the silence had the quality of expectation in it, the quality of something that has produced a signal and is now waiting to see what the signal produces. I got out of bed. I went to the window first, which I understand now was probably not the right instinct, but it was the instinct I had to look, to see, to convert the unknown into the visible and therefore manageable. The window gave me the 40 yards of open ground, and the tree line beyond it in the thin light of a partial moon, and the open ground was empty, and the tree line was dark, and I could see nothing that accounted for what I'd heard. I stood at the window for a long moment, looking at the place on the exterior wall, where the sound had originated just below, and to the right of the window frame, roughly at the height a standing person's knuckles would be if they were standing close to the wall, and I could see nothing there either, nothing attached to the wall, nothing on the ground below it, nothing between the house and the trees. I went to my aunt's room and knocked softly on the door, and when she said, "Come in," I opened it and found her sitting up in bed in the way of someone who hadn't been fully asleep, or who had moved quickly from sleep to wakefulness without the transition showing. She looked at me in the dim, and her expression was not the expression of someone who had been startled or alarmed. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for a particular thing to happen, and was now observing that it had happened on schedule. I told her what I'd heard. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she told me to go back to bed. She said it in the tone she used for things that were settled, not unkind, not dismissive, but final in the way that statements of fact are final. She said, "Don't answer it. No matter what it does, or how long it goes on, or what it starts doing to make you want to open the door, don't answer it, and don't go outside." I asked her what it was. She looked at the window of her own room for a moment. Her room faced west, the roadside, away from the tree line, and then she told me. She said it had been coming to that wall since the winter 11 years ago, a few months after she'd moved in. She said she'd asked around, eventually, carefully, and had learned that the man who'd owned the house before her, an older man who'd lived there alone for a long time, had died in that back bedroom. Not violently, not dramatically, just died in the night the way old people who live alone sometimes do, and wasn't found for several days. She said she didn't know what the connection was, if there was a connection, and had decided some time ago that knowing wouldn't change the terms of the arrangement. She said it came every few weeks, always to that wall, always the same 3 knocks, always at night. She said it had never done anything beyond the knocking. She said she'd learned to sleep through it. Then she told me to go back to bed, and I did because there was nothing else to do, and because the particular quality of her calm, not the calm of denial or suppression, but the calm of genuine long accommodation, was more stabilizing than anything else I could have encountered in that moment. She had made a kind of peace with it. I could borrow the shape of that peace for the night, even if I couldn't share its substance. I lay in the dark in the back bedroom, and the knocking came again at intervals. I eventually stopped trying to time. 3 knocks, the measured pause, silence, and then after a period that might have been 20 minutes or 40, 3 knocks again. It never varied, never accelerated or intensified, never moved to the window or the door or any other surface. Just that one section of wall, at that consistent height, with that specific and patient rhythm that my body had decided from the first instance was not produced by anything belonging to the category of wind or animal or structural settling. My body had made that determination and held it through the entire night, and no amount of rational argument moved it. I thought about the man who had died in that room. I thought about what it meant that the knocking had started after his death rather than during his life, and what it might mean that it came specifically to this wall and not to any other surface of the house, and what it might mean that it had been coming for 11 years, with a consistency that suggested not randomness, but purpose, not haunting in the dramatic sense, but something more like repetition, like a habit that has outlasted the context that produced it. 3 knocks. The specific number and rhythm of someone who has always knocked this way, who has done it so many times that the pattern has become inseparable from the intention behind it. Come to the door. I'm outside. Let me in. It stopped at 3:58 in the morning. I know the time because I'd been watching my phone's clock in the dark for the last hour. Not for any practical reason, but because keeping track of the time gave me something to do with my mind that wasn't listening to the silence between the knocks and filling it with things I didn't want to put there. 3:58, and the last set of 3 knocks ended, and then there was nothing. No retreating footsteps. No sound of movement through the open ground toward the tree line. Just the knocking, and then the absence of the knocking. The transition between them as abrupt and total as a light being switched off. The silence that followed was worse than the knocking had been. The knocking had been awful in the specific, concrete way of something present and unaccountable. The silence was awful in a different way, in the way of a question without an answer, in the way of wondering whether the cessation meant departure or simply stillness. Whether whatever had been standing at that wall was gone, or was simply done knocking and was now doing something else in the dark outside a window, I no longer wanted to approach. I didn't sleep again before morning. When the light came, and I got up and went to the kitchen, my aunt was already there, coffee made, and she looked at me with the measured sympathy of someone who has been through a thing and is watching someone else come through it for the first time. She didn't ask how I'd slept. We drank our coffee and looked out the west-facing kitchen window at the gravel road and the ordinary gray morning. And after a while, she said that it always stopped before 4. In all the years she'd been keeping loose track of it. I asked her if she'd ever thought about leaving. She looked at her coffee cup for a moment, and then she said that the house was hers and the knocking wasn't, and that she'd decided a long time ago not to let the one drive her from the other. I've thought about that framing a lot in the years since. The house is hers and the knocking isn't, as if the knocking is simply a feature of the property that predates her ownership, and will likely outlast it, like the angle of the afternoon light or the way the porch boards flex in cold weather. Something to be known and accommodated and lived alongside rather than solved. I've never stayed in that back bedroom again. I've visited Patrice several times since, and I sleep on the couch in the front room now, and she's never commented on the change, and I've never explained it. Some accommodations don't require explanation between people who both understand what's being accommodated. The knocking is still happening. She mentioned it last spring in passing. The way you mentioned weather said it had come twice in March, same as always. She sounded neither troubled nor resigned. She sounded like a woman describing the ordinary facts of a life she has chosen and continues to choose. In a house at the end of a gravel road where something comes to a wall every few weeks in the night, and knocks 3 times in the rhythm of a person who has always knocked that way and cannot seem to stop. I want to be clear about something before I tell this story, because I've told it a few times now to people I trust, and the response I get most often is a version of, "Are you sure you didn't imagine it?" And I understand why people say that, I do, but I need you to understand that I am a person who drives carefully and pays attention and does not pick up hitchhikers as a general rule. And the reason I'm telling you this is that what happened that night in Cherokee County was real, in every sense of the word real, that I know how to apply to an experience. I was not tired beyond ordinary tiredness. I was not drinking. The rain was coming down hard enough that I had my wipers on high and my headlights on, and I was doing 40 in a 50 because the road was slick, and I am the kind of driver who adjusts for conditions. I was paying attention. That's what I need you to hold on to. I was coming back from a job site outside of Andrews, heading south toward Murphy on a state road that runs through the river bottom before climbing into the mountains on the Cherokee County side. It was November, a Tuesday, somewhere between 7 and 7:30 in the evening. The rain had started around 4 and had been building since then into the kind of sustained hard fall that turns mountain roads into something requiring respect. My headlights were cutting maybe 100 feet into it, and the road beyond that was just dark and rain, and the occasional reflective glint of the center line. I saw him about a quarter mile outside of Murphy proper, walking the center line in the southbound lane with his back to me and no light of any kind. I hit my brakes and swung right before I'd consciously decided to, the way the body acts before the mind has finished the calculation. I came to a stop on the shoulder, maybe 30 yards past him, and sat there for a moment with my hazards going, watching him in my mirrors. He had not altered his pace or his course. He was still walking the center line, moving toward my stopped truck at the same steady rate he'd been moving when I'd first seen him, as if the near miss was a fact he'd registered and set aside as irrelevant. I should have driven away. I have a whole architecture of reasons why picking up a stranger on a mountain road at night in the rain is a decision that doesn't end well, and I've built that architecture over years of being a person who moves through the world with reasonable caution. But he was old. I could see that as he came up alongside my truck, the white of his hair and the particular gait of a man past 60, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose joints have opinions about cold and wet. And he was soaked through in a way that communicated genuine exposure, not just caught in a shower wet but saturated. His work clothes dark with water from collar to boot, and the temperature outside was maybe 42 degrees. And I am not the kind of person who can watch an old man walk a center line in the rain and drive away from it. I leaned over and opened the passenger door. He got in without hesitating and without saying thank you, which I registered but didn't attach significance to yet. He pulled the door shut and sat with his hands on his thighs and looked straight ahead through the rain-covered windshield. He smelled of wood smoke and wet wool and something earthier underneath, the smell of outdoor work and outdoor living accumulated over a long period of time. His hands on his thighs were the hands of someone who had used them for physical labor for decades, broad and dark-veined and scarred across the knuckles in the small ways that come from years of contact with rough material. I asked him where he was headed. He said up the mountain. The inflection was flat and specific, like a statement of coordinates rather than a direction. I asked which road, which mountain, which end of the mountain, the kinds of clarifying questions that the situation seemed to require. He said up in the same tone each time, as if the elaboration I was asking for was either unavailable or unnecessary, and after the third or fourth exchange I stopped asking and put the truck in drive and headed south toward the mountain roads that climbed out of the Murphy Basin, because up was the information I had and up was what I could provide. We drove in silence for a few minutes, and I did what I do when I'm nervous, which is talk. I asked him if he lived up the mountain, if he'd had car trouble, if there was someone I should call for him, whether he wanted me to turn the heat up. He answered the questions that had answers in the same flat, factual register. Yes, he lived up there. No car trouble, no one to call. The heat was fine, and the answers were complete in the technical sense without being informative in any meaningful sense, each one closing off the line of inquiry it addressed without opening anything adjacent. I couldn't get a handle on him. Every answer gave me nothing to hold on to, nothing to follow up on, nothing that produced the sense of a person assembling in front of me, the way conversations usually produce a sense of a person. He was just there, beside me, wet and composed, and looking straight ahead. We climbed out of the basin on a road that switchbacks up the face of the ridge, the rain heavier at elevation, and the dark absolute beyond my headlights. I'd gone maybe 6 miles up from the valley floor when he said stop. I stopped. We were on a straight section of road between two curves. No shoulder to speak of, guardrail on the right side where the ground dropped away into a drainage. On the left, the mountain rose steeply into dense timber that began at the road's edge without transition, no verge, no fence, just the pavement ending and the forest beginning. There was no driveway, no mailbox, no break in the tree line that suggested a path or a logging road or any point of entry, just the mountain going up into the dark. He opened the door and got out. I sat with the engine running and watched him in my headlights. He stepped to the front of the truck and stood there for a moment in the rain, looking at the tree line on the left side of the road. Not at me, not at the truck, at the trees, with the specific quality of attention you give to something you are about to do, or enter the preparatory look of a person gathering themselves. The rain came down on him and he didn't react to it at all, didn't hunch or turn his face away, just stood there in it, the way you stand in weather you've stopped noticing. Then he spoke without turning around. He said, "You shouldn't drive this road after dark." He said it in the same flat register he'd used for everything else. Not as a warning delivered with urgency, but as a statement of fact being passed along. The way you'd tell someone that a particular road floods in heavy rain. Useful information offered without drama. Then he said, "There's people up here that remember things being different." I started to ask what he meant. I got as far as drawing breath for the question before he walked into the trees. Not into a gap in the trees, not onto a path into the trees. At the point where the forest met the road edge, pushing into the undergrowth the way you push through something you know the other side of. Within 3 steps, the dark and the rain had taken him completely. I sat there with my headlights on the tree line and waited for a flashlight beam, for the bobbing light of someone moving through timber, for any luminous evidence of his continued existence and forward progress through the forest. Nothing. The trees were dark, and the rain came down on them, and there was no light and no movement and no sound I could hear over the engine and the rain on the roof of the truck. I want to tell you, I sat there for a long time, that I waited long enough to be certain. I didn't. I put the truck in drive inside of 2 minutes, and I went back down that mountain, at a speed I'm not proud of. Every interior light in the cab burning dome light, dash lights turned to full, my phone screen on, and propped against the console because the dark outside the windshield had taken on a quality I didn't want to be alone in. A specific weight that had something to do with what the man had said, and something to do with the way he'd walked into the trees without light or hesitation, and something to do with the phrase he'd used, which I couldn't stop turning over. People up here that remember things being different. I've been over it many times since. The most charitable reading is that he was an old man, possibly not entirely well, who lived somewhere in the timber up that mountain in a way that existed outside ordinary infrastructure, and that his comment was the kind of oblique local knowledge that old mountain people sometimes pass along in terms that mean more to them than to the person receiving it. People who've been in those hills long enough that their relationship to the land and the history of it is personal and specific in ways that don't translate cleanly into a sentence said to a stranger in the rain. That reading is available to me, and I use it when I need to sleep. What keeps it from settling completely is the other part, the way he'd walked the center line in the dark without concern for the cars, the way he'd gotten into my truck without gratitude as if the ride were something owed or expected, the way he'd stood in the headlights in the rain and looked at the trees with that preparatory attention, and then the walk into the forest itself. No light, no path, no hesitation, no sound. as if the timber at the edge of that mountain road was as familiar to him as the inside of a house he'd lived in for a very long time, as if the dark in there was something he knew the shape of. People up here that remember things being different. I've parsed it every way I know how, remembered differently by whom, and different from what, and in what direction the difference runs. Was it better once, or worse, or simply other? And what does it mean that the people who remember it are still up there in the dark, on the side of a mountain that a stranger advised me not to drive after nightfall? I take a different road now when the job takes me through Cherokee County in the evening. It adds 12 minutes, and nobody has ever asked me why I go that way. I haven't explained it to anyone in terms that would satisfy a reasonable person, because the explanation requires you to have been in that truck, in that rain, watching an old man in wet work clothes walk into the trees on the side of a mountain road and disappear without light, without sound, without any of the evidence that a person moving through a dark forest at night should leave behind them. I still don't have a good answer for what he said. I've stopped expecting one. Some things said in the dark on a mountain road are not meant to be answered. They're meant to be carried, quietly, and respected in the particular way you respect a warning whose full meaning you've decided you'd rather not pursue. Darren was the most experienced backcountry traveler I knew personally. I want to establish that clearly because it matters to everything that follows, and because the temptation when something goes wrong in the wilderness is to find a way to make it the person's fault, to locate an error in judgment or a gap in preparation that explains the outcome, and by explaining it, makes it avoidable for everyone else. I've heard people try to do that with what happened to Darren in the Sitico Creek wilderness, and it has never sat right with me, because the Darren I knew did not make the kinds of mistakes that produced the outcome he came out of those mountains with. He was 31 years old. He'd been backpacking since his mid-teens. He carried a well-considered kit and knew how to use every item in it, and he'd done solo trips in remote wilderness more times than either of us could accurately count. He was not reckless. He was not careless. Whatever happened to him in those 4 days was not the product of inexperience or poor planning, and I think it's important to say that plainly before I tell you what we found when we went looking for him. He'd gone into the Sitico Creek wilderness on a Thursday in early October, planning a 6-day loop through a section of the Cherokee National Forest in Monroe County, Tennessee, that he'd researched for months and partially scouted the previous spring. The Sitico drainage is remote in the genuine sense of the word, not remote the way people mean it when they're describing a trailhead that requires a gravel road, but remote in the sense of real distance from roads and infrastructure and other people, the kind of terrain where a person who gets into serious trouble has a meaningful problem on their hands before help becomes a realistic possibility. Darren knew this. He'd filed a trip plan with his sister, including his intended route, campsites, and a check-in schedule he'd call from the one reliable cell coverage point on the route, a high ridgeline on the 2nd and 4th days, and if she didn't hear from him by a certain hour on either of those days, she was to give it 6 hours and then call me. She called me on the 4th day. He'd missed both check-ins. I called Marcus and a guy named Spence who'd done search work before, and the 3 of us were on the road before midnight with enough gear for 4 days. And the trip plan Darren had filed with his sister, printed and marked up on the seat between us. His family didn't want to call official search and rescue, yet his father was convinced there was a simple explanation, a dead battery or a route change, and wanted us to look first. I understood the impulse, even if I didn't fully share the confidence behind it. And the truth was that 3 people who knew the terrain and knew Darren could cover ground faster and with more contextual judgment than an official team in the first 24 hours. We went in at first light on Friday. We found the route he'd planned to follow and tracked it by the signs that an experienced backpacker leaves without meaning, to the occasional boot print in soft soil, a snapped twig at trail junctions where he'd pushed through, the fire ring at his first planned campsite that showed ash consistent with use 2 or 3 days prior. He'd been en route at least through day 2. We pushed hard on the first day and found nothing beyond those minor traces, camping that night at a spot near the creek and going over the map until we'd identified every variant route and every likely deviation and assigned each of them a probability based on what we knew about how Darren thought in the field. The second day we went off the main trail. It was Spence who suggested it. He said that if Darren had found something interesting on the approach, a view or a drainage or a piece of terrain that caught his attention, he'd have gone off trail to investigate, and that the section of country between the main trail and a long laurel slick marked on the topo would be exactly the kind of place that would catch his attention. We dropped off the trail mid-morning and pushed through mixed hardwood for about 40 minutes before the terrain funneled us into a hollow and we found the camp. It was tucked into the edge of the laurel slick at the hollow's upper end, in a small clearing that I would not have called obvious from any direction. You had to come at it from below, through the hollow, to see it. And even then, the laurel on three sides compressed it into a space that felt found rather than chosen. His tent was there, a three-season solo tent in the olive green he favored, staked correctly and tensioned properly, the rainfly attached and the footprint spread beneath it, with the care of someone who sets up camp the same way every time because good habits become automatic. His food bag was in a tree, 15 yards from the tent, hung correctly on a line between two branches at the height and distance that bare country requires. His trekking poles were collapsed and leaning against a tree beside the tent door. His boots were just inside the tent door, unlaced, set neatly side by side, toes pointing out, the way you leave boots when you've taken them off for sleep, or for a short walk in socks that you intend to extend no further than the fire ring and back. The boots were dry on the outside and showed no signs of recent use. The fire ring held ash that Spence estimated at 48 hours old, possibly more cold and compacted, the edges weathered in a way that said no fire had been added to it in at least 2 days. Inside the tent, his sleeping bag was unzipped and thrown back the way you throw it back in the morning when you get up with the intention of returning to pack it. His headlamp was clipped to the tent loop above, where his head would have been. His journal was open to an entry dated the 3rd day of his trip, the last line of which I read once and haven't read again since, because the content of it didn't help me and I preferred to leave it where it was. Everything in the camp was in order. Everything around the camp was not. The ground in a wide radius around the tent, extending from the tent door out toward the tree line on the open side of the clearing, covering an area of maybe 30 by 40 feet, had been disturbed in a way that I spent a long time trying to interpret and couldn't fully account for. Not dug up, not torn, not the explosive disruption of a large animal moving through at speed. Pressed and dragged were the words that kept coming to me. The leaf litter had been compressed in patterns that suggested something moving low and slow across the surface, or something being moved across it, or both. The disturbance was too consistent and too directional to be random, and it covered too much area to be the product of a single passage. It looked like whatever had made it had spent time in the clearing, had moved through it repeatedly, in more than one direction, over a period of time long enough to leave a record in the forest floor. And then there were the trees. At the edge of the clearing on the open side, the side that faced out of the hollow down the slope, there were 4 trees, 2 beeches, and 2 maples of moderate size, and on each of them, at a height of roughly 5 to 5.5 feet from the ground, the bark had been stripped in long vertical lines, clean lines, each one 6 to 8 inches long, running parallel to each other with a spacing and consistency that I stood in front of and studied for a long time without being able to attribute to any animal I could name. A bear strips bark differently with hooks and drag and a signature that's distinctive and recognizable once you've seen it. This was not that. These cuts were made by something moving in a single controlled downward direction, producing a clean separation of the outer bark from the cambium beneath, the exposed wood pale and slightly damp in the October air. The consistency between the 4 trees was exact enough that the same instrument, the same edge, the same pressure, the same motion had made all of them. Not something. I kept coming back to that. The cuts were too clean and too consistent for something. Something does not produce that level of repetition without variation. A person does. We called it in at 3 in the afternoon. We gave the coordinates of the camp to the Monroe County Rescue Coordinator and waited there until the team arrived, and then we briefed them on everything we'd found and walked out because our role was finished and staying would have complicated their work. I looked back at the camp once as we left the clearing, at the tent and the hung food and the trekking poles and the boots just inside the door, and I felt the specific sorrow of a campsite that contains a person's careful preparations in the absence of the person. Darren was found 4 days later by a rescue dog team, 7 miles from the camp in a drainage on the far side of the ridge, in a condition that the official report described as moderate dehydration and exposure with no traumatic injuries. He was ambulatory and coherent when they reached him. He knew his name, knew the date within a day, knew that he'd been reported missing, and that people had been looking for him. What he did not know, and what he has never been able to recover in the 3 years since, is anything that happened between the moment he left his tent in socks. He remembered that specifically. He'd stepped out of the tent in socks because he'd only meant to be outside for a moment, and the moment the rescue dog found him 7 miles away on the other side of a ridge, he had no planned route over. 7 miles of wilderness terrain, in socks, with no pack and no food and no water and no memory of any of it. The doctors who examined him had no explanation that satisfied anyone, including themselves. Dissociative episode was the phrase that appeared in the documentation, which is a medical way of saying we have a category for the fact that this happened, but not for why. Darren accepted the phrase and didn't argue with it. And I think that's because arguing with it would have required proposing an alternative, and none of the alternatives were ones he was willing to articulate out loud. He never went back for his gear. His tent and food bag and trekking poles and journal are still in that clearing, or what's left of them after 3 years of weather, slowly becoming part of the forest floor they were set on. I offered once to go back for them, and he said no, clearly and finally, in a tone that didn't invite follow-up. I haven't offered again. I think about the marks on the trees. I think about how they were made, and by what, and about the patterns on the ground around the tent, and about a person stepping out into a cold October morning in their socks, meaning to come right back. I think about the 7 miles between the camp and where they found him, and what 7 miles of that terrain looks like in the dark without boots or light or any of the equipment he'd packed so carefully and hung and staked and arranged with the automatic competence of someone who had done it. So many times it required no thought. I think about what could make a person walk 7 miles without remembering it. What could make that gap in a person and fill it with something they come back from but cannot account for, and leave them on the other side of a ridge with nothing missing from their body, but everything missing from the 4 days between. I don't have an answer. Darren doesn't have an answer. The rescue report doesn't have an answer. Some things that go missing in those mountains don't come back with explanations attached, and some of the people who go missing with them come back in a condition that makes explanation feel beside the point. He's fine now, mostly. He lives in Knoxville and has a job and sees people and moves through the world in the ordinary ways. But he doesn't go into the backcountry anymore. He doesn't talk about why. He doesn't need to. The Nolichucky had been running clear and cold all 5 days, the kind of late September water that looks black in shadow and green in direct light, and that carries you along with a current, strong enough to feel but gentle enough. In the lower sections we were floating, to allow for long stretches of just sitting in the boat and letting the river do the work. There were 4 of us, myself, a man named Gil who'd organized the trip, his younger brother Trace, and a woman named Sandra who worked with Gil and had more river experience than any of us, despite being the quietest person in the group about it. We'd put in above the gorge section on a Monday morning and had been working our way downstream through some of the most remote stretches of river in that part of Tennessee, camping on gravel bars and cooking over fires and covering 8 to 12 miles a day depending on the water and how often we stopped to fish the eddies. It had been, by any honest accounting, a nearly perfect trip. The kind of trip that reminds you why you do this, why you arrange your life to make room for days that exist entirely outside the infrastructure of ordinary existence. The last night we made camp on a wide gravel bar on the right bank, a natural stopping place where the river bent and the current pushed, a broad tongue of rounded stone out from the tree line far enough to pitch 4 tents with room between them. The forest on our side rose steeply from the bar's edge, second growth with some significant old timber higher up, the ridge above us invisible in the dark by the time we had the fire going. On the far bank, maybe 60 or 70 feet of black water away, the forest came down to the river's edge without a gravel margin, the trees beginning at the waterline on a bank that rose sharply into the same kind of steep timbered slope that walled us in on our side. The gorge character of the Nolichucky in that section means you're always between walls, rock or forest or both, and at night those walls close into the distance your firelight reaches and no further. Everything beyond that circle, belonging to a darkness that the river sounds fill, but don't explain. We'd eaten and talked, and let the fire settle into the comfortable diminishment of a late campfire, and by 11 the others were in their tents. I'd volunteered for watch without much deliberation. I'm a light sleeper by nature, and the last night of a river trip always produces in me a reluctance to let go of the waking hours I have left in it, a desire to stay with the experience until staying is no longer possible. I had my headlamp on my forehead, a thermos of coffee that Sandra had made before turning in, and the low company of the fire and the river and the dark pressing in from both sides. It was the kind of watch that doesn't feel like obligation. It felt like the right way to spend the last hours of something good. I swept my headlamp across the far bank sometime around 2 in the morning. Not for any particular reason, just the periodic check that becomes automatic when you're responsible for a camp's awareness, the routine visual inventory of the perimeter. My headlamp caught the eye shine, and my brain processed it in the automatic way. The brain processes eye shine when you've spent enough time in the outdoors. Identify, categorize, assess, move on. The identification happened. The categorization did not. The eyes were on the far bank, at the waterline, or just above it, in the dark beneath the first row of trees. I can tell you the color of the shine, the way you can always tell the color of eye shine in a headlamp, a pale amber orange that sits at the warm end of the spectrum, the color that deer produce, and that I've seen hundreds of times in 30 years of moving through these mountains after dark. The color was familiar. Everything else was wrong. They were too high. A deer standing at a riverbank produces eye shine at a height I know from long experience, and these eyes were above that height by enough that the discrepancy was immediate and unambiguous. Not dramatically higher, not so high as to suggest something implausible. Higher in the specific way that a person's eyes are higher than a deer's eyes when both are standing at the same distance. That's the comparison my brain made, and then immediately tried to unmake, cycling through alternative explanations, the way it does when the first explanation is unacceptable. A deer on a slope, a deer with its head raised, a bear standing in an unusual posture, each one failing against the fixed data of the height and the distance and what I was seeing, and they were too far apart. That was the second thing, arriving a fraction of a second after the first. The interocular distance, the gap between the 2 points of reflected light, was wider than deer, wider than bear, wider than any animal I could place in that bankside habitat with any confidence. Wide in the way that a human face is wide relative to most of the animals you encounter in temperate forest at night. I am aware of how that sounds. I was aware of it then, in the same moment I was registering it, and the awareness didn't change what I was seeing. What changed nothing, most of all, was the stillness. I've been around enough wildlife at night to know what eyeshine does when a light source hits it. Animals react to light. They may not bolt immediately. They may hold for a moment in the freeze response, but the eyes move. They shift with the animal's assessment of the threat. They track or they turn away. They exhibit the quality of an animal, processing new information and deciding how to respond to it. These eyes did none of that. From the moment my headlamp found them to the moment I made myself lower the beam, they did not move. Not a fraction. They were fixed on our camp with a completeness that felt less like the stillness of a startled animal and more like the stillness of something that had already been looking at our camp before my headlamp found it, and that the light had not surprised because it had been expecting the light, or was indifferent to it, or had decided that the light changed nothing about what it intended to do. I sat with that for a long moment. The river moved between us. The eyes stayed where they were. I raised my headlamp again and swept it slowly across the far bank and found them again immediately. Same position, same height, same spacing, same absolute stillness. 60, maybe 65 feet of river between whatever was producing that eyeshine and the 4 tents behind me. I went to Gil's tent first because he was the closest and because he was the most likely to stay calm at being woken at 2 in the morning. I put my hand on his shoulder and kept my voice below the river sound and told him I needed him to look at something. He was out of his sleeping bag and beside me inside of 30 seconds. The way people who spend real time in the outdoors come out of sleep. Not all the way alert immediately, but functional, oriented, ready for information. I pointed at the far bank without using the headlamp. I told him to look at the water line under the first row of trees and tell me what he saw. He looked for a long moment. Then he said, "Eyes." I said yes. He looked for another moment, and I watched his face in the peripheral light, and saw the same sequence of processing I'd gone through: my self-identification, attempted recategorization, the specific expression of a person whose catalog of explanations is not producing a satisfying match. He said they were too high. I said I knew. He said they weren't moving. I said I knew that too. We woke Trace and Sandra the same way, quietly and one at a time, and both of them saw it within seconds of looking. Nobody spoke above a whisper, and nobody suggested a confident explanation, because the explanations that fit the data were the ones none of us wanted to say out loud in the dark on a gravel bar with 60 feet of river between us, and whatever was standing at the waterline on the far bank, looking at our camp with that fixed and patient attention. We let the fire burn down. That was a collective decision made without discussion. I stopped adding wood, and nobody suggested I should add more. And we sat together in the diminishing light and watched the far bank, and the eyes watched us back. The river kept moving between. The darkness on both sides kept its own counsel. I've thought a great deal since about the quality of the attention those eyes represented. There is a category of being watched that is ambient and impersonal, the way you're watched by animals that register your presence as information to be assessed and responded to. And there is a different category, rarer and more specific, of being watched by something that has identified you as the object of its attention and has made a choice to keep that attention on you. The second category has a quality the body recognizes, even when the mind is still assembling the evidence. What I felt sitting on that gravel bar in the diminishing firelight was the second category, complete and unambiguous, and I felt it for the better part of 3 hours. The eyes went out sometime between 4:30 and 5. Not in sequence. Not in the way eyes disappear when an animal turns its head and the angle of reflection changes. Both at once, simultaneously, as if a switch had been thrown, present and then not present, the far bank dark and uniform and offering nothing. No sound of movement through the brush. No disturbance of the water that would have suggested crossing. No retreating crash through the timber. The eyes were there, and then they were simply not there, and the absence was as absolute as the presence had been. We packed camp in the gray light before full sunrise, moving with the efficiency of people who have a shared and unspoken understanding of the situation. Nobody ate breakfast. We broke down the tents and loaded the boats and were on the water before the sun cleared the ridge, and we floated the last 6 miles to the takeout with the current and said very little. On the drive home, Gil drove, and the rest of us sat with our own thinking, and nobody offered an explanation. It wasn't that we hadn't considered them, we had. All of us. I could see it in the quality of the silence. The working silence of people turning something over and not being satisfied with what they're turning up. It was that the explanations we'd each arrived at independently were worse than the alternative of not naming what we'd seen. Some things you can metabolize more cleanly as mystery than as conclusion. The conclusion we were all circling required us to accept something about what had been standing on that bank for 3 hours in the dark, watching 4 sleeping people on a gravel bar with the fixed attention of something that knew exactly what it was looking at and had decided, for reasons that remained entirely its own, that looking was enough. I float other rivers now. There are good ones, plenty of them, within a day's drive of where I live, and I've had fine trips on all of them. I haven't been back to the Nolichucky. Not because I've made a formal decision about it, not because I've sat down and reasoned my way to an avoidance, just because when the planning conversations come around, when someone mentions the Nolichucky, something in me goes quiet and steers elsewhere, and I've learned to trust that quiet the way I've learned to trust other things. My body knows that my mind hasn't fully caught up to. The eyes were there for 3 hours. They did not move, and they did not look away, and they did not cross the water. That last part is the one I return to most often, in the particular way you return to the thing that provides the least comfort. It stayed on its side of the river. It watched, and it stayed, and then it chose to stop being visible. And that choice, the quality of intention in that disappearance, the sense of something deciding rather than something leaving, is what I carry from that gravel bar on the last night of a trip that had been, until 2 in the morning, nearly perfect. It watched us for 3 hours, and then it decided we weren't worth crossing the water for. I have spent a long time trying to find comfort in that. I haven't found as much as I'd like.